Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Working Group 1 meeting for the Extended Day-Ahead Market Initiative, which focuses on the supply commitment and resource sufficiency evaluation topics. I'm Brenda Corona, representing the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I will be providing support for this meeting. For today's agenda, we will finish the discussion on the continued failure consequences, and then we'll conclude with the RUC and CV with Mark Richardson, and then we'll have a start on the conversation with EDAM transfers with Danny Johnson, and a recap with Bob Cox. We also have Phil Penningal, who is also the coordinator of all the EDAM working groups and is available to help respond to any questions if needed. A few meeting reminders is that this is intended for collaborative and encourage you all to ask questions and share your perspectives on the topics. Please feel free to raise your hand at any time, and Mark will call on you. Once your line is unmuted, please start by stating your name and affiliation. These meetings are recorded, and we post the video files on the corresponding working group web pages, where you will find other materials related to these meetings. The recordings and other related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And then now I'll go ahead and turn it to Mark to go over some meeting objectives. Mark?
Thank you, Brenda. Can you confirm you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, team. I definitely appreciate everyone's time today. Happy Monday. As Brenda mentioned, I wanted to pivot from the RUC and convergence bidding topics and utilize the first part of today's meeting to focus and conclude the topic of RSE failure consequences. I did give a heads up prior to concluding last Wednesday's call that we were going to be revisiting this item today. To date, I haven't heard too many ideas from external parties on this design element, and I understand it to be integral, so I'm interested to see if any thoughts came to fruition over the weekend. I do want to acknowledge and state that there were a few hands left raised at the end of the ISO's RUC and convergence bidding presentation last week, so I'll do my best to circle back on that topic during today's call to the extent time allows. I think what I'll be looking for from stakeholders here is what lingering concerns, questions, or clarifications are needed to help stakeholders become more comfortable with the elements of RUC and/or convergence bidding in the context of EDAM. I also hope as a group to start the discussion on the confidence and certainty around EDAM transfers. I know this coming Wednesday, Bobby Olson from SRP will be sharing a few examples on this topic to help frame and facilitate the conversation. I stated last week that the ISO will be posting some questions for this group to provide feedback on. Please note these questions are getting finalized now and will be posted later today for this working group community to informally respond to. These questions are intended to provide the ISO policy team with the different perspectives on the topics and elements discussed to date and potentially help formulate the straw proposal. Given that these are informal questions, I do request to the extent possible, try to keep those responses brief and as targeted as possible. So let's start today's discussion on failure consequences by me teeing up some of these questions here for the audience. I'm going to read each question one by one, pause, and to the extent I don't get any hands, I will be calling on, the different parties and sectors throughout the community to kind of get some of that feedback and what their thoughts are. All right, so financial failure for consequences. Scope of consequences. Is there merit to increase consequences for persistent failures? So I understand we haven't necessarily came up with what these consequences are going to be yet. That's what we're going to be doing today. But, regardless of what those consequences are, does it make sense to increase those consequences to the extent a party is persistently failing? Let me pause there and get some feedback from the audience. I see Stuart Kelly with his hand up from LA. Go ahead, Stuart, and thank you for being willing to comment.
Yeah, Mark, I don't know so much if it's increasing consequences for persistent failures or an ultimate backstop of freezing transfers. I think the latter incentivizes others to take the necessary kind of RA actions through the ordinary course of business to prevent this. So I think there needs to be some backstop of freezing transfers. Would be my thought.
Okay, so to the, and is that on a, let's say entity fails, 2, 3, 4 hours in a row at some point after X amount of hourly failures, are you proposing then at that point transfers are frozen going forward or move to zero going forward?
I don't know if it's necessarily intraday or even daily. There could be certain circumstances. I think Nevada's got some good examples of fires and system outages that put the network in a certain position that they may want to rely on additional supply if it's available. So I don't TBD in terms of the details, but ultimately some form of backstop with the details to be worked out, Mark.
Okay, no, I really appreciate that, Stuart, and I'd like to hear from the audience on their thoughts on that backstop mechanism that you referred to as it pertains to potentially freezing transfers, as well as does it make sense to increase these consequences for consistent failure? So thank you for being willing to speak up first, Stuart. I appreciate it. Let me see if I can look at the queue here, see if there's anybody else. I see Alva in the queue. Go ahead, Alva.
Yeah, just following up on what Stuart said, I think I agree that that's kind of the basic remedy that has to be arrived at some point. But another part of that has to be, how do you then essentially cure that? How does somebody come out of being in that state? Do you just, I don't think it's a pattern of persistent failure would not result in being, having transfers prevented for one day necessarily. And the question of how you would then, I assume it'd be another form of demonstration that would allow you to then more fully participate in the market, but that would be part of what you want to look at there.
Yeah, so Alva, real quick for my own understanding, when you say another form of demonstration, you mean showing that you're supply sufficient and ready to re-engage and opening those transfers back up, so passing the RSE?
Yeah, this gets to this whole, the original thing that was being talked about an advisory filing of some sort, which would actually be meaningful, where a participant could show that they've essentially cured their deficiency in the foreseeable future, or for over a period that was agreed on, that would be appropriate.
Okay, no, thank you for your comments. I see Danny Johnson from the ISO, who's also a panelist today. He has a few slides to help tee up the EDAM transfers a little bit later. Danny, did you want to respond to Alva?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. This is Danny Johnson from the Cal ISO. I'm just trying to think through what you said and maybe the tie into that 45-day advance showing, but I think from what we've heard, a significant volume of capacity that would be shown is made up of these import RA or WSPP contracts that entities may not have a specific source that they can identify in that time frame. So I guess I'm a little wary of relying on a 45-day showing, because I'm not sure what it would entail if an entity said, yeah, I'm planning on 20% of my load being served by unspecified resources that I have a forward contract for.
And Michelle, if you don't mind unmuting Alva to be able to respond to that, I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Danny. And I think that was just an example. I think you'd actually want something that had, was more clearly defined in terms of how that demonstration would happen. I would think it might involve some demonstration of some forward contracting that actually exists, as opposed to just a plan. That's about all I can think of in response to what you're saying. I do think just a non-binding plan to address a deficiency would probably not be enough. If we're starting from goodwill, and then there's a systematic deficiency, then it needs to be cured in a way that everybody can really depend on, I think.
Okay, I think that makes sense. Thanks, Alva.
Sure.
All right, I see Kevin Smith with his hand up. Let's go to Kevin.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Kevin Smith, Balancing Authority, Northern California. I agree with Stuart. We've talked a little bit about this among various folks, and this is kind of a challenging topic. I don't know if you're going to get to it, but it could, because this is specific to financial failure. But I think there needs to be robust oversight and reporting on these things, kind of coupled with this, so there's a lot of transparency. And I kind of go back to the August events in 2020 and just a lot of confusion. Of course, that was not related to this, but there was issues about resource sufficiency in EIM and transfers that were occurring, and I know a lot has been done to tighten up the RS test, and there's still other things we're talking about as far as penalties and other things related to that in the EIM space. But even there, I think part of this, to be effective, needs to include robust and transparent oversight, because, and I hate to put it this way, but shame is a good tool. We all, I think, as BAs, pride ourselves in coming to the table fully resourced. We have our own retained reliability obligations and other things, and those don't go away in EDAM. And so I do think that's part of the equation, and maybe we'll get to it later. I didn't see anything posted as an advanced slide sheet, in case you're going to touch on that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kevin. And I apologize for getting the slides posted probably 20 minutes prior to the call. That's on me, as I was working to finalize the deck. I can definitely take that note. I just made a note of it from an overall transparency. I think I heard last time we were talking about this topic a few weeks back that, overall everyone agrees there needs to be some level of transparency. So I'll definitely capture that note and see if we can get something similar or comparable to what we're doing in the Western Energy Imbalance Market for RSE.
Yeah, my expectation is that DMM, and if there's an independent market monitor down the road or something else proposed, that they would have an active role in providing reports and other things to, ensure that these types of things aren't occurring and are not serial in their nature. So, I think financial penalties, I get that. And I also, again, I agree generally with what Stuart said, but the devil's going to be in the details on that. And, at some level, I know as a group of EIM entities or EDAM entities, whatever you want to call us, had discussed this prior about kind of a ratcheting up of consequences. And so I think we generally support the concept to prevent this kind of serial leaning. But I do think that the other transparency pieces will help as well. They can't prevent it, but we certainly don't want our organization's broadcasts as not having done sufficient planning.
Right. No, I appreciate that. I do know DMM, Department of Market Monitoring, is an independent entity. So I did make a note and definitely will follow, because I know they're involved with the RSC for Western EIM reporting. So I'll make a note and follow up with the appropriate teams internally. So I appreciate your comments there. Let me go to Carly Page. Michelle, do you mind unmuting Carly's line? Thank you.
Does this work now?
Yep, I hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. My name is Carly Page. I work at the Public Utilities Commission of Nevada. And I appreciate Stuart's comment that shame does work. And I guess I'm still struggling with how the shame / incentives will be passed through to some of the smaller LSDs in the footprint of each EDAM entity. And the devil, Stuart's right, is in the details here. I'm still not 100% certain how punishing or imposing failure consequences on an EDAM entity that is I think, going to be a BAA is going to incentivize desirable behavior for all of the entities inside that BAA. And is there any details worked out on how those incentives get passed down the chain? Or are we just going to assume that the EDAM entities will wrangle their own cows?
Yeah, no, great question. And I'm actually going to punt that question to Danny Johnson, who's kind of leading this policy effort here. Danny, did you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I think I actually like the analogy of herding cats. But I think the thought is that each BAA would retain the similar liability responsibility that they have right now to make sure that they're doing sufficient for procurement. So I don't think that we, through the EDAM, would envision dictating how different potential EDAM entities want to manage their reliability and their forward reliability procurement for their BAA control area. We're just simply trying to have a test that makes sure all of the transfers that take place in EDAM are mutually beneficial, and then to the extent that there is a insufficiency, that the EDAM can be used to potentially cure that, but does not become a crutch which would prevent the appropriate forward procurement.
Thank you. And Michelle, do you mind unmuting Carly's line again, please?
Sorry.
Go ahead, Carly.
That's super helpful. I guess, look, I'm no expert, I'm not the utility. I guess I think perhaps in some cases we might be overestimating how much the BAA procures things for some of the load serving entities inside their footprint. So much as, I mean, they provide ancillary services, of course, but there are LSCs inside Nevada that are buying their own supplies. And so I don't, and that might not feel shame. So I don't know how exactly to make sure that they're also planning in a similar way to what I think the community expects.
Yeah, thank you, Carly, for your comments. I see Milosh's hand up. Milosh from the ISA, did you want to add to this conversation? Michelle, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Milosh's hand, thank you.
All right, yes. Good afternoon. This is Milosh from the California. So, hi, Carly. Yeah, and I'll just echo a little bit and expand upon what Danny said. But, I would envision that each EDAM entity or each Western EIM entity that ultimately considers joining the EDAM, they would conduct their own internal stakeholder processes and discuss some of these elements with their customers, how to organize themselves to ensure that as a BA, they're meeting the resource sufficiency requirements. And then similarly on the consequence side, to the extent that any consequences befall due to failure to pass the RSC, how those consequences, if they're financial, how those costs and those consequences ultimately are spread across the balancing authority area and across its entities, depending on how they may want to do that. But I would envision that would largely be, more of a role for the EDAM entity to work together with its entities within the balancing authority area to demonstrate that resource sufficiency, and whether that includes certain OAT changes or whatnot. But that coordination, I think, will be important. And just to also put it in perspective, Carly, here what we're talking about, at least with this first question, is there merit to kind of increasing or having some kind of consequence for persistent failures? So this relates more kind of to that persistency, but I think your point is fair that any kind of failure, would need to provide some incentives or some kind of a message to the entity to work towards becoming sufficient. So just wanted to put that in the larger context here. At least what we're talking about is that increased consequence or a consequence for persistent failures. But I think your point stands true even outside of this persistency question. Any kind of a failure of the resource sufficiency evaluation, how does the balancing authority area work with its load serving entities and other entities within its BA to ensure that they're coming sufficient into the day-ahead market and avoiding any kind of consequence?
Thank you, Milosh. All right, let's go to Dan Williams. Thank you for your patience, Dan.
Hey, Mark, no problem. Good discussion there. I think really good comment by the previous caller there from the Utility Commission in Nevada. My question is just a clarification. Is there a diversity credit embedded in the EDAM RSE or even in the RUC process, like somehow in the uncertainty requirement, uncertainty targets or something in the VERS forecast? And if I need to explain what diversity, I'm thinking by diversity credit, I can, but I figured folks would understand that.
Yeah. Danny, did you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, Mark. So, Dan, I think the initial thought is that we likely would not include that, a diversity credit in the RSE. The idea then is that the diversity from the entire footprint, to the extent that all entities are procuring that very high confidence level of uncertainty requirements, then gets carried over into the EIM, where the entities can potentially work together to benefit each other, which I think that if we can table that for now, we have a slide on this concept later in the presentation.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the reason that I was asking is it just kind of gets to one of the questions of the economic fairness and what's actually going on in EDAM that is a little bit different than in EIM, and that may speak a little bit to having a different failure consequence in EDAM than in EIM. Because the diversity credit is such a big part of the benefit that shows up in EIM. If it's not there in EDAM, then there may just be a different fairness question. And with that, I think the other comment I just wanted to make was that I still feel like we're missing a bit of the context of what's going on with market transactions in this day-ahead space and kind of contrasting that to what shows up in the market right now. And if we assume that EDAM is a very comprehensive market and that it sort of subsumes all CAISO intertie activity, then that means that EDAM has both sort of loosely termed RA energy being optimized, but also just economy energy being optimized and displacement transactions happening through it that we're used to seeing more as intertie bids for imports and exports or done as bilateral transactions in the day-ahead market. And so I think we often lose sight in these conversations, or just don't hear it talked about as much, as sort of how there may be third parties or there may be residual supply out there that's not forward committed, that is a pool to be optimized in EDAM and available capacity to be optimized in it, since there won't be another market for that supply to go to.
Dan, I'm trying to kind of understand the last part of that question. Why wouldn't the third-party supply that has bids in be optimized? Because I would think that it would be.
No, I'm saying it would be, but it may not be under contract. Where we talk a lot about entities making their forward procurement decisions, and that's sort of setting the basis for assessing resource efficiency. But we don't tend to, or I haven't heard much discussion of sort of where third parties fit into that, who may have surplus capacity, whether they're a load-serving entity or an independent power producer or something along those lines, a marketer that is going to be optimized through EDAM, but may not necessarily show up on a supply plan, or maybe just needs more discussion of how they show up on supply plans.
Yeah, I think when we talked about this a few weeks ago, maybe even a month ago now, the thought was that the supply would just be credited to the available supply within each EDAM BAA for purposes of passing the RSE, and then those bids would flow through to the actual optimization.
Okay, I guess I must have lost track of that nuance of it. But you can keep moving forward.
All right, thank you, Dan. And then Stuart, Alba, I see your hands are both still up. Did you guys have further comments or simply forget to put them down? I see Stuart's hand went down. Alba, did you have another comment before I move on to the, nope, your hand went down as well. Perfect. All right, so I heard the, for that first question, the ratcheting up idea for persistent failures, at least a few entities echoed that thought as well, going back to what Stuart stated in the beginning. Let's move on to the next question here. So thoughts on different levels of financial consequences depending on the time of year of failure, in summer, stress conditions, or any other conditions. Given that the EDAM is a much larger footprint, understanding that different BAAs have different peaking times of the year and things like that, I would like to see what the reaction is there. Does that make sense? Is that getting too complicated from a financial consequence standpoint? Let me pause there to see what the audience thinks. All right, Jeff Nelson, thank you for raising your hand.
I'll even lower it. Thanks, Jeff Nelson, SC. Good afternoon. Really, there's sort of like 2, maybe 3 states. If everything's just humming along and the market is just, rich with capacity, rich with supply, it kind of doesn't matter. And then at the other extreme, we're having reliability issues and people are taking drastic measures, whatever, dipping into reserves. And then it really, really, really matters. And then somewhere in the middle, you're approaching something that's sort of hairy, but it's not hairy yet, technical term. So I'd be more inclined to, if we're going to have different sort of approaches during different conditions, not to sort of predefine them based on time or hours, but to define them on actual system conditions. Just my thought.
Okay, so using, maybe the defined, EEA 1, 2, 3 definitions, as an example, is that where you're going? To the extent a BAA declares one of those levels of a reliability event, then maybe having different levels of financial consequences based on that. Is that what you're stating, Jeff?
I mean, that's a way to do it.
Okay.
Other ways could be looking at sort of supply-demand balances, transmission constraints, anything that's going to put a balancing authority in a tight spot, any balancing authority in the EDAM, could be something that's considered. We had some issues in some of our earlier comments because it's not clear to us on if all of those emergency levels are really reflective of sort of supply-demand imbalance, or there's other operating conditions that are coming into play. And it's also not clear to us how demand response programs are being treated in some of those conditions.
Okay. I see Danny Johnson with his hand up.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, just following up with Jeff, I'm trying to figure out what the counterfactual would be, because I don't think that we're planning through this process to develop any rules or any tests to see how tight a BAA would be, or what internal transmission constraints they might have that would make it difficult for them to serve their load. I think the only counterfactual that we would have is the RFE test itself, and I guess what is the delta between the showing and the requirement, but I'm not sure. I haven't even thought through the implications of potentially penalizing entities who barely, or creating different sets of consequences for entities who just pass the RFC by a little bit versus those that are way long.
Yeah, and that's not what I was implying. So counterfactual generally happens after the fact. And I'm, for example, the ISO has both a $1,000 cap and a $2,000 cap. And under certain circumstances, we're here in the day-ahead time frame, right? So it's unlikely that people are going to be in EA conditions during day-ahead time frames.
Right.
But the $1,000, $2,000 cap, that happens. There's triggers. They're looking for, prices out in the market somewhere. They're looking for conditions. They're looking for actual production costs getting above $1,000. So we do have triggers today in the market that as conditions are strange, the rules change. So that's just the thinking. Maybe it could be a similar trigger that they're using in the day-ahead market.
Okay,
all right,
well,
thank you,
I think
Jeff.
we can give some thought to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I see Ryan's hand up from Portland. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. This is Ryan, Portland General. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Just kind of a side comment. I think one of the difficulties with talking about increasing the magnitude of consequences is without confirming that entities have ample opportunity through advisory testing to identify and cure any deficiencies. We've talked about an on-demand advisory test several weeks back, and it was noted in the weekly summary, but we've never really circled back on it since then because we seem to move through these working groups on a topic-by-topic basis. It seemed like there was broad support for that and would certainly help frame how entities participating in EDAM would conceptualize some of these broader questions, because if we have ample opportunity to test and the test is accurate, then it might be easier to envision steeper consequences. So that's just a side note that I have in my head, and I'm sure when I bring this back to our group to talk about it, that's something that they will bring up again. But it would be nice to circle back to that or get confirmation that that will in fact be included in the issue paper of the straw proposal.
No, I appreciate that, Ryan, and I believe what I heard, in the previous meetings and George's conversations internally is that, there will be that on-demand advisory run where entities, given all of the different items that it will be considering, some of the resource constraints and things like that, it sounds like entities will have the ability to run it up to 2 to 3 times an hour, and then the 9 a.m. scheduled binding run on top of that. So I hope that helps provide a little context to everyone on this call. And Danny or George, feel free to raise your hand if I'm, misinterpreting where I believe we landed on that. But hopefully that kind of helps inform individuals on this call going forward around these failure consequences and the amount of times an entity would be able to see where they stand prior to that binding run.
Thanks, Mark. I think that was my understanding too. The other nuance that I would add is that we would have planned times when we would freeze the VER and the load forecast to provide some certainty such that when an entity was running this, they would have a stable target that they're trying to meet as well.
Great point. Thank you, Danny. All right, let's go to Kevin Smith.
Kevin Smith Bank. So I think Ryan raised a good point. I guess what I was thinking in terms of the questions that are being posed is kind of in the end, it's going to be the sum of all the parts. And so there are pieces that when you start talking about financial penalties, you have to also be assured that the test is reasonable and fair. So while theoretically I can say, yeah, I think there should be potentially financial penalties and even a ratcheting, that presupposes that the rest of the test is equitable and so forth, which we haven't really developed in detail. And so, but I just want to echo what Ryan said, because when I'm thinking about this, I'm also going back to what we had talked about, which is in this kind of quasi-optimization that's going to occur, that I'm going to have tools as an EDAM entity to be able to figure out where I am in the process and whether I'm going to meet that test by the time I actually go into the, kind of the final run, kind of the binding run of the RSE. And then the other piece, going back to what Dan had said, I think I wasn't sure if I understood where he was going. I think I do, and I'd kind of be interested in hearing his thoughts on this. But what I was thinking is I don't know how we access and, this gets back to cure, what's out there to cure with in short order. And is there something that's more organized and available to the EDAM entity, like a single type market that we can look to as opposed to, picking up the phone and calling individual entities? And I wasn't sure if that's what he was envisioning because, the RSE, is it's not a binding, IFM or other kind of a run. It's just a test that's telling my BA where I'm at. So how does that interact with another market? So we won't know the results of what was bid and taken by CAISO, by the time the RSE is already run. And so how do we have something available to us that's, liquid and available for cure? And that's kind of the issue I was thinking about, is just this issue of how do we cure besides just bilaterally? And I was wondering if that's where Dan was going to as well.
Thank you, Kevin. And okay, looks like Dan already raised his hand. Let me go to Danny Johnson first, and then I'll turn it over to Dan Williams.
Thanks, Mark. So I think this concept, Kevin, is something we've tried to raise previously, and I think that going forward we can talk about more, and it's the bid range or imbalance capacity trading. The idea is BAAs would have the ability to kind of somewhere show that they have surplus capacity and make an arrangement to offset the requirements of their neighboring BAA who they've made that arrangement with prior to the test. So I think on the curing, there's two curings. There's the curing before the test and the curing after the test. That'd be the curing before the test. I think a couple of weeks ago we posited, is this like a bulletin board? Is this a platform that the ISO is creating? Is there the opportunity for a third-party vendor to kind of work with the ISO to create this platform? I think we would be open to those options if there is interest from the stakeholder community, but I do think this is a topic that we've contemplated some previously in this working group.
Yeah, I think I might have gotten off a little bit on that. So forgive, I'm just processing it in my mind, and now you're reminding me. I mean, we've talked about this. It's just I'm still struggling with the time periods and how these are all going to, and that goes back to, I guess, just back to what Ryan was saying, is that, a lot of this it works if there are reasonable options for entities to be able to cure, and also that the test in and of itself, when settled, is reasonable and achievable, which I suspect it would be, but it's kind of, until it all kind of hangs together. So by isolating these issues, it's just a challenge to give an affirmative one way or the other until you see it all. Anyway, thanks, Danny. I appreciate it.
No, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate your comments. And, I do know one of the common design principles is to create and design a reasonable and fair test. So I would hope that's the result of this working group. Let me go to Dan Williams, and then we'll go to Michelle Keto from the CPUC.
Hey, thanks. And Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. So Kevin, that was kind of one part of where I was going. It's sort of that question of, if the market's all comprehensive, everyone's all in, where does the extra supply come from? And I think I've stated before, I'm cautious about having anything non-centrally cleared as a solution when maybe there's a centrally cleared and fully, quote, in the market way of doing this that makes sure that you're getting to a least cost solution and not just relying on people, bilaterally trading, sort of at the last minute before the market does its thing. But that question of kind of how does a resource help be part of the solution if they're not already committed to the BA that they reside in, I think is a good one. And I think also tied up in that is the question of intertie bidding and, how useful that could be for liquidity, including, peer-to-peer, market-to-market optimization or something along those lines that may be a possibility in the future. So I think it's a, good discussion, but I hope we can keep it going towards truly efficient ways of incorporating all the energy and capacity that's going to be available.
Thank you, Dan. All right, let's go to Michelle Keto.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto from the CPUC. One thing that I'm struggling with is in the EIM space, the failure sort of occurs in the real-time market. So you're prevented from getting additional transfers. And so when you're talking about failure consequences, I'm trying to understand, are you literally talking about that the failure would be imposed based on day-ahead conditions, or would the failure be imposed going into the real time. So imagine a situation where we're in stress system conditions and you fail the RSE, but it turns out the load forecast was way off, and it turns out in the real time, you were sufficiently resourced. So that's one example. So, and then I have another question.
Yeah, no, let me try to, as the facilitator, take a swing at that. Good question, Michelle. So up to now, the conversation has been in the day-ahead context to the extent an entity fails, right? It's a 24-hour evaluation. I think everyone established that in the beginning. To the extent an entity fails a few hours, what are those consequences, right? Based on all the information that we have going into that test in the day-ahead time frame, not what's actually materializing in real time. So early on, at least what I gathered from the conversations was it may not make sense to completely lock an entity out of, zero transfers, because then you're kind of limiting the benefits of, a larger pool of resources and being in EDAM, as well as potentially changing some of that optimization in the EDAM footprint. So before I kind of pause and say that's the final answer to that first question, let me confirm with Danny that I characterized that correctly.
Yeah, I think we're just trying to explore, Michelle, what is the potential for the day-ahead market to cure a deficiency. I think you're right to the extent that if an entity doesn't want to cure a day-ahead deficiency, they could flow into real time, and then in the real-time RSE, the WEAM RSE design would take place as it's currently implemented today. So I don't think this is necessarily a requirement to do this. It's rather we're trying to figure out, is there a way to do this to cure it in the day ahead, because that probably is a better long-term solution for reliability and costs to the extent we can resolve these in a day ahead time frame.
Okay. So my follow-up question is, I imagine that these failures will primarily occur in stress system conditions, which to me means everyone's going to be activating their demand response programs. And I'm just wondering how activation of demand response programs will be reflected in the day-ahead market. Will it only be reflected to the extent that it's bidding? And if it's not, you have something in EIM where people sort of adjust their load forecast to reflect it. So I guess there's two questions, one of which is, are you imagining that this would port over to EDAM? And then would you also imagine that the ISO would do something similar as well?
Yeah, so Michelle, good question. I can speak to the demand response side, and that's just really pulling from some of our early on conversations around resource qualification and accounting details. And, absent a new DR model, I believe the path forward was to allow entities to represent that DR as a load adjustment. And then at that point, I will pass it to Danny to further answer your question.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, that's where we ended is one of the paths forward would be to represent this as a load adjustment in the demand forecast that gets used in the RSE and would get used to clear RUC to the extent that we move forward with having a RUC. I do think then some thought needs to be given to how load is bid in versus what is shown as a load reduction in demand response. But that's one potential option. The other option, I kind of jokingly called it a proxy demand response, which would be a way to represent this that doesn't have the current qualifications of our PDR model. However, I think we'd be open to both items and would shed more detail on them in the straw proposal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Danny. And I'm glad I wasn't too far off base there. Appreciate your questions, Michelle. All right, let me pose this last question, and then I think I'm going to turn it over to Danny to go through a few proposal options around failure consequences. So does it make sense to increase the magnitude of the consequence depending on the magnitude of failure? So example, if an entity fails by, say, 10 megawatts, and let's say, just for purposes of conversation, the consequence was $100. to the extent the entity fails by 300 megawatts, does it make sense to increase that failure penalty by a certain amount? So let me pause there. That was a really high-level hypothetical example, and see what the stakeholder community thinks about that particular option as well. So if an entity fails by 10 megawatts versus failing by 200 megawatts, should there be a different level of consequence? I see Michelle with her hand back up. Thank you, Michelle. Go ahead.
So I guess the only thing I'd say is in your slide it says percentage of requirement, and it probably makes sense to stick with something like that. 10 megawatt failure for, a 50,000 megawatt BAA is really not the same as a larger failure. So I think that's the only thing I'd say.
No, good point. Good point. So, if an entity fails by 1% versus failing by 3%, should those failure consequences be higher or more punitive?
Yeah, I think that's more consistent with what CAISO has done previously, right? With things in the EIM where if your load forecast is off by 5% or something like that. So that's all. Thanks.
Michelle, this is Danny at the IA. So I think the way we phrase this in the WEAM RSE is it's the greater of 1% or 1 megawatt.
Yeah.
Thank you, Danny. Let me go to Stuart Kelly in LA.
Thanks, Mark. I think this is where this gets real tricky, and I appreciate Michelle focusing on the load forecast, because that load forecast is substantially off. Then as ratcheting up becomes somewhat problematic if a lot of the failure is based on a erroneous load forecast. It's really, what level of confidence do we have in that day-ahead load forecast? Because we've expressed concerns about that before, and the importance about that before in this stakeholder process. And I think it's going to be a real downside when it comes to the RSE test. So difficult to answer. No, without putting all these pieces together, I guess.
Yeah, no, Stuart, I definitely can appreciate your comment there, and I'm familiar with some of the items that you have been working on personally. I think and part of the earlier conversations where the EIM entity had the ability to provide their own forecasts was to help ensure that the most accurate forecast is being utilized. So, let's assume for sake of argument, the most accurate forecast is being used. Kind of going back to this question, do you agree with Michelle that if an entity fails 1% versus 3% of their forecast, does it make sense to increase the magnitude of those consequences for failing?
I think my initial blush is yes, but if I take in the wider context of trying to, have folks build policies that kind of precludes them from failing, it kind of leans to one level of consequence that is somewhat detrimental from failing. I may be a little bit Luddite in my views, and probably will soften with more information, but I just kind of start from a very conservative viewpoint, I think, when it comes to this.
No, thank you, Stuart. Appreciate that. Let me see if I can get someone from the Southwest or the Pacific Northwest entities to weigh in here. Do we have? I heard Ryan from Portland. Is there anyone from Idaho willing to speak up? PowerX, I haven't heard from you. SRP, APS, NV. Any of you parties willing to weigh in here on this last item? Thank you, Bobby. I got Bobby Olson from SRP.
Hi, this is Bobby Olson from SRP. Mark, thanks for calling out. In terms of the increasing magnitude for consequence, The percentage requirement, you know, I kind of hesitated when I heard 3%. I mean, 3% of a 50,000 megawatt load, that's 1,500 megawatts. That could be a lot of dependency within the market. But kind of realistically, from a pragmatic perspective, I get concerned about increasing consequences depending upon how much is known with respect to the uncertainty product that's been discussed about being needed as part of RSE. If there's a fair amount of uncertainty that's not really known at the time that we're putting that in because of the way that it gets calculated, I think that has to factor into what the consequences are of failure and kind of helping to inform what that looks like. I agree with what Stuart was just referencing regarding the concept that kind of having this sliding scale or incremental scale regarding consequence of failure can have unintended consequences where there's strategic football leaning as opposed to really just focusing on trying to meet the core definition of what we're trying to accomplish with RSE. So I have some of those outstanding concerns, but kind of echo common theme of comments so far is devil will be in the details in terms of how it gets put together to understand what that holistically looks like. Hopefully that's helpful.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Bobby. I appreciate you weighing in. And then I see Todd Ryan as well. Let me go to Todd.
Good afternoon, Todd Ryan with PG&E. I'm just curious if the CAISO is going to do any kind of footprint-wide check in terms of in this kind of pre-day-ahead time frame, because one, I think it might be helpful in terms of just assessing reliability needs, but second, I do agree with Jeff Nelson's comment that the timing, the system condition at the time of failure makes a big difference. And so understanding if there is significant supplies, significant amount of economic transfers that could be made available, would speak to whether, this is a critical time to levy huge penalties or whether, that amount of allowing economic transfers is a, appropriate function of the market.
No, I appreciate that. Danny, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So, Todd, I think you're highlighting a point which we've come to understand is that the CAISO as a BAA will probably need different mechanisms than currently exist to participate and make sure it can cure resource insufficiencies in the day-ahead time frame. Currently, our day-ahead process kind of does that moving into real time. We don't have an existing process that does this pre-day ahead beyond what is procured through the RA process. So I would envision the CAISO or either the CAISO or somebody in California running this for the CAISO BAA and then needing a process to figure out how any incremental procurement would occur and how those costs would get allocated within the CAISO BAA to make sure the CAISO was able to also pass the RSE.
So that's helpful to hear, but I don't think it was what I was imagining. I was imagining, again, EDAM footprint-wide.
Yeah. So, Danny, to the extent, I believe the question was, does the ISO envision doing a check across the entire EDAM footprint from an overall resource sufficiency standpoint prior to diving into the individual EDAM entity BAA sufficiency?
I think that check would occur to the extent that we want to allow incremental transfers to a insufficient BAA to make sure that insufficiencies aren't spread and we don't create constrained, insufficient multi-BAA pockets due to transmission limitations. But to the extent that we just run an EIM RSEE and then if that passes, not run any BAA specific RSEs, I don't think that's something we're contemplating.
And I don't think I was your question right. Well, I wasn't suggesting that if there's 1 megawatt extra surplus that we allow all transfers, that, I think we could have a rational system by which we come up with understanding of whether there's excess supply and economic transfers that could be made, or whether allowing such transfers might create reliability needs. It seems a little more nuanced. So, but just something to think about. Thank you for your time and thought.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I don't see any other hands up at this point. Danny, I know you had 2 examples that you briefly presented on 2 weeks back. Did you want to give a recap of those examples? I know you have some slides here to kind of help spur some conversation.
Sure, Mark. I think those slides should look pretty familiar. I would ask everybody to keep in mind the discussion we just had regarding potential increasing consequences if there's persistent failures, different levels of financial consequences. As we kind of talk through these 2 potential implementation mechanisms, because I think it'll be useful to see if one implementation path is preferable to this community. The other thing I'd add is Mark is right that we largely presented these slides a couple weeks ago. I don't think that we received a ton of comment and really had a super detailed discussion at that time. Hopefully, everybody on this call has had a couple weeks to think about this issue for a little bit. They're able to have a more robust discussion today. Do you want to move to the next slide, Mark? So the first idea, again, was the hurdle rate. So this would essentially be an EAM RSC would, or an EDAM participant would fail the RSC in an hour, and a hurdle rate would be implemented on transfers into their BAA. The benefit here, I think, is that it ensures, to the extent that it's priced, that hurdle rate would be at a penalty price. It would ensure all the supply is utilized within that BAA. I think that it is worth discussing if this hurdle rate could be implemented at lower than the penalty price, because the more it deviates from what prevailing bilateral prices are outside of the EDAM, I think this type of ability to cure financial consequences could actually be a detriment to the value proposition of EDAM. But that does bring up another question of if an entity is resource insufficient, is displacement on their existing resources appropriate if there is lower price supply elsewhere within the footprint? I mean, all these, this is all stuff that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. I was almost more looking to see if stakeholders had given this any more thought and the feasibility of implementing financial consequences through some type of hurdle rate. And if it's a hurdle rate, should it be at the penalty price or should it be somewhere lower?
All right, so let's pause there then, Danny. Thanks for kind of teeing that up. And again, I know we covered this 2 weeks back. So, can I get a show of hands, what your thoughts are on this hurdle rate, and to the extent you agree with this hurdle rate, at what rate should that be? So I don't see any hands. Does that mean everyone agrees with this hurdle rate, or, oh, there we go. Thank you, Bobby.
All right, trying to react in real time to the hurdle rate. I think the question comes down to how is the hurdle rate getting set? How does that relate to maybe some of the other components going on in the kind of the bilateral trading? Does it create incentive for maybe not curing as you work through it? So there's immediate reaction is kind of some questions around what the hurdle rate is. Is it dynamic? And how does that relate to kind of creating optionality and incentive to make a decision as to whether or not a BA is attempting to correct versus just kind of playing arbitrage against the hurdle rate?
So, Bobby, if I understood, you think that having it be dynamic in anything other than a penalty price could potentially bias the design and have entities strategically fail and look to cure through the EDAM?
That's right, Danny. Thanks for being much more clear about my thoughts than I were. But yeah, that's really are we unintentionally creating that incentive? I would think that having a dynamic rate may be more constructive towards minimizing that incentive, especially if it's just a fixed rate that might create some challenges there. Because then it's clear what the hurdle is and where that gaming may go on.
Yeah, I like the idea of a dynamic rate. I'm just trying to think of how we would set it, and that's where I start running into issues. I think back to the system market power initiative that the ISO ran a couple of years ago, and we were trying to set thresholds of when tests would be run against prevailing bilateral prices, and it was not a straightforward exercise. And this adds the complication of this is already done in the day-ahead time frame. So I think we'd be open to ideas to make it dynamic and would want it to at least be above what the spec would be within the footprint. I guess between there and the penalty prices is the question.
Okay. Let me see if I can get Jan's thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is Jan from San Diego. I second the previous discussion. I think that was right on the money. Where my concern is, I don't know how you set the rates, and even if it's sort of dynamic, again, it's still the same problem. How do you set it? I think these rates are really not efficient. They're going to influence prices in a way that's going to cause, I think, some unintended consequences. So I'm not really comfortable with the hurdle rate approach at all. And I would suggest, this is my own thinking, that we focus more on administrative type solutions to insufficiency.
Thanks, Jan. And I think we do have a slide next that will talk through kind of administrative potential applications of administrative penalties.
All right. Let's go to Carrie next.
Hey, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Powers Trading Forum. This is probably just echoing Jan, but yeah, there really isn't such thing as a prevailing dynamic bilateral price. So I don't think the concept quite works. And then likewise, completely agree, it breaks. If you did try and implement something, it would break the efficiency and kind of the theoretical concept of marginal cost pricing in a market. So I think you'd be breaking market efficiency for not much gain. Thanks.
So Carrie, that speaks more to the potential to dynamically set it. What's your thoughts on if it's just set at the penalty price to ensure that all resources are used and prices, I guess, go up as designed, and that it can't be used for gaming opportunities?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, is the penalty price supposed to mimic some sort of capacity price? Like, what are you trying to achieve with that? Are you trying to raise prices? That still doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, so your concern would be even if we would go to the bid cap, that's still not a good proxy for what a forward capacity price would be. And so this could still be a means to avoid sufficient forward procurement.
Yeah, I actually would be less concerned that it would be a means to avoid forward procurement, and then more that you would be adding a cost that doesn't exist in the variable time frame, right? Like, why would your LMPs be formulated based on this cost? It has nothing to do with any sort of variability or practical cost in the system at that time. You're now mixing capacity and energy in kind of an inappropriate way, in my mind.
Okay, I think I understand your concern. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, let's go to Laura and then Jeff.
Thanks, Mark. And we're still trying to think through all of these different options. But I know one of the things we've talked about internally is that because BPA is such a big BA with so many load-serving entities within our BA, that it's a lot. It will be a big burden on us to figure out the sufficiency of every LSC in our BA. and then with financial consequences to allocate those appropriately to whoever was insufficient. And so we've liked the idea of having optionality in failure consequences, where if I'm reading this correctly, during the failed hours, transfers are limited, and there may be ability to have some type of optionality that if you want to increase transfers, then you can do that at a penalty price. But you can also just decide to have your transfers limited as an option. And so I know that's been important to us with the EIM resource efficiency test. And I just wanted to test my understanding. Is that what we're talking about in this option as well?
Yeah, no, good question. And go ahead, Danny.
I think all options are on the table. I think to the extent that in any bids in supply, I think it could be used to cure any entity who wanted to utilize the EAM to cure their day-ahead insufficiency. But regarding optionality on a BAA, receiving this type of, or curing their insufficiency through the EDAM, I think that is a reasonable request.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let's go to Jeff Nelson.
Jeff Nelson, SC. I'll apologize in advance. I had a lot of technical hearing issues, so I may be repeating something, and I'm sorry if I am. Back to my sort of earlier comments where there's likely to be like 3 scenarios. You know, if we're in that third scenario where things are really bad and people are taking all sorts of emergency actions, you know, the price might be right through some very high hurdle rate, but it may be inappropriate to actually allow additional transfers because you may be doing whack-a-mole, right? One balancing authority is now getting some supply at the expense of another balancing authority, and you may have just shifted the problem. We've got to be really careful in the design that it is not that sort of whack-a-mole where it just shifts around. If we're at the other end where, hey, you know, nothing's wrong, and I think this was, I think Carrie and Jan, if I could hear them right, just imagine, you know, whatever, you're a $40, $50 day, and for whatever reason, the RSC, you fail it, and as I understand this, you'd have a very high penalty price to try to absorb all your resources first, but if you failed, I'm not sure you're going to have resources enough to pass. I'm not sure how that works. So it could be a very mild day, and all of a sudden you're paying $2,000 for energy. Or I don't know what you're paying for, because someone was noting you're kind of mixing energy and capacity. But that just seems like a completely inappropriate result, that it's just a mild run-of-the-mill day and something went wrong and now your prices are super high. And maybe I'm misunderstanding the proposal, but if something worked that way, then that's a really bad design. And then you're sort of got the third scenario where things are getting tight, but not, you know, miserably tight. Well, maybe in that stage, the penalty prices make sense. So I think that's a long way of saying that I think this hurdle rate's got a lot of issues with it, and we need to be really careful. Thanks.
No, thank you, Jeff. And ISO team, I didn't know if, you know, Jeff mentioned in the beginning, to the extent supply is extremely tight and, you know, the results of that are multiple entities selling the RSC for a given hour, to ensure, you know, transfers aren't happening and putting BAAs in, you know, a more undesirable outcome. Are there any mechanisms on the BAA side that they have in a day-ahead time frame to prevent that? I see Danny with his hand up. I don't know if that's from before, though, Danny.
No, it's to this point, Mark. I think this is something that I thought about a little bit. Any relaxation of transfers would be done with the assumption that we're not transferring the insufficiency from one BAA to another. I think the simplest way to think about this is, rather than to test if the footprint as a whole is capacity long or is bid long, you would look at the immediate neighbors of the deficient BAA and test that they have sufficient excess capacity as well as the transmission to deliver that capacity either directly or wheeling through one of the other neighboring BAAs to facilitate curing the deficient BAA. So anything that we would do along these lines would meet that criteria. So one BAA's insufficiency isn't getting transferred to a different BAA or spread to multiple BAAs.
Okay, thank you. Todd, I see your hand up. Was that from before? Or did you have another comment?
I have a new comment.
Go for it.
Can you hear me? Great. Todd Ryan from PG&E. Just on this hurdle rate specifically, one thing I would be concerned about is the incentive this might create to withhold capacity from the market. This is a voluntary market, and that's been well established or well drilled into us, and there could be an incentive for BAAs that are, because it's a repeated game, who likely know that they're needed in certain hours or certain months or certain times of the year, and they may have an incentive to offer fewer megawatts or at higher prices, or offer less transmission in a way that creates, that helps to foster this, like, kind of this back end, this reverse scarcity pricing process to happen. By reverse, I mean, like, this is scarcity pricing by another name, right? So I just feel a little uncomfortable with what this is setting up. If what we're trying to incent is the most transmission and the most generation into the market. Thanks.
Yeah, Todd, I completely agree with that point. Like, I think what you're describing is just classic withholding, and I think we would try to strive to not have this incentivize that. And then the other thing that Laura brought up of curing through whatever EDAM mechanism we end up designing optional, I think would try to serve to somewhat prevent that too.
All right, I see Carrie with her hand back up. Go ahead, Carrie. Carrie, you may be on mute on your side.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, double muted. Carrie Bentley, Western Power Trading Forum. Going back to the question from PG&E earlier where they asked if there would be a system-wide test, I was thinking about when the hurdle rate might be appropriate. And while it's not my favorite consequence, I think the one circumstance where you could, I think, theoretically apply the hurdle rate is if you did a system-wide test and you deemed there to be a system-wide shortage, and then you looked at the individual BAAs that were short, and then I think you'd be able to appropriately apply that scarcity hurdle rate. But without that first check on whether there is system-wide scarcity, I think you would end up with the wrong price signal. But so, okay, yeah, I know this is something I'm just throwing out there for consideration. Yeah, somebody to think about.
No, that's exactly why we're having this working group. That's an interesting idea that we'll take under consideration, Carrie. Thank you.
And then, Carrie, as a facilitator, not to put you on the spot, but you started with this not being your favorite idea. Do you mind opining on what is?
I don't think WPTF has a favorite idea yet. We just have a least favorite idea, which is one that distorts market prices. Sorry.
I gotcha. Thank you. No, that's okay. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I appreciate it. Thank you for your comments. All right. Any other comments before Danny moves on to the next slide, the next option here? All right. Go ahead, Danny.
Okay, well, let's move to the next slide. So the other option would be to try to have some type of administrative penalty. The idea here is that we're running the EDAM RSE on a day-ahead basis, and so if you set the objective function to minimize the total number of insufficient megawatts a BAA would have when running that optimization, you'd have a starting point that if you relax transfers, you would at least know what the counterfactual is and could price those incremental transfers at some type of administrative price. So this is, I think somebody preferred the administrative penalty earlier or administrative consequence earlier. This is one way that could be implemented. I want to note that the same reliability insurance that we'd have with the hurdle rate where you would ensure that the capacity insufficiency from one BAA isn't transferred would also be in place here. I think this failure consequence does give additional options on revenue allocation. I think it could be done pro rata. You could look at who are the net exporters in the EDAM and allocate this revenue to them on a net export pro rata basis. So I do think that's one plus of this mechanism, but again, this would be an outside the market administrative penalty, which is, I don't think, ideal either. So I'd be interested in hearing comments and thoughts on the feasibility of this approach as well.
All right, Jan stuck his end up quickly. Thank you, Jan.
That was Jan San Diego. Yeah, just to follow up real quickly on this. I like the administrative approach better, but I agree, even setting the penalty is an exercise in probably ultimate futility. You know, I'm kind of wondering if you really wouldn't want to take a little different approach, which is to watch for leaners after the fact basis. And, you know, when it becomes apparent that they're doing it persistently and in large magnitude, then you take the administrative step. And what that step is, I mean, I'm not sure, but as I understand it, at least in EIM, they actually limit the amount of transfers that the entity can take at that point. And that would sort of be the last step of the process. So anyway, that's just top of my head. That's kind of the way I'm thinking about the administrative approach.
No, thank you, Jan. So if I heard you right, don't apply any penalties unless, you know, as part of this review, you know, whatever entity or organization is responsible for that, you know, whether it's the ISO or DMM or, you know, some of the other items I heard on this call, you know, to the extent there's habitual leaning, then start applying some of these after the fact penalties and things like that, potentially leading up to limiting of transfers. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want us to even start applying penalties. Maybe you go right to the limiting of the transfers. You know, what I keep thinking here is we're trying to develop a centralized market where we help each other. That's the whole point here. Somebody has short, somebody's long. We can do an economic transfer. Everybody wins. And so you want to kind of maintain that, you know, philosophy as best you can. Now, I certainly appreciate that, you know, parties don't want somebody taking advantage of that in some long-term capacity sense. But again, this is a day-ahead market. I would focus our remedies on the administrative end, and I'm not even sure a financial penalty is the right hammer here. No, I appreciate that context and point of view. Let me go to Danny Johnson at the ISO, then we'll go to Jeff Nelson.
Thanks, Mark. So I think on the surface, Jen, what you said makes a lot of sense. At least in the EIM context, the concern I've heard with that approach would be, what does persistent leaning during a normal day look like versus what is somebody leaning for 1 or 2 hours on the hottest day of the year look like? And trying to make an equivalency of those two things, I think, starts to get a little bit challenging.
All right. Michelle, did you mute Jan's line before we move on? I wanted to see if Jan had a response to that, or if you wanted to comment. No further comment. No, I appreciate the remark. Okay. No further comment. Okay, thank you. All right, let's go to Jeff Nelson.
Really, hi again, it's Jeff SE. Sort of out of the box thinking, and because people are pointing out a lot of the trickiness of this, and again, it's the day ahead market. So I'm not sure how this is going to interact with RUC, right? So one thing is if someone potentially had this shortage in their RSE, is to force them or try to pick it up in RUC. So by the time they get into the real-time test, there's, I don't know, somehow some extra capacity that was secured in RUC. And so that would be a different approach. It's like, well, we're not going to penalize you, but we're going to increase your RUC requirement. Another approach, and then make sure you get the RUC costs allocated to them. Another approach, and I'm sure this is going to be really popular, and I look forward to hearing people respond to it, is if they were short in the RSC, require the host balancing authority to carry additional reserves to cover the shortage. Then whatever, if they've got some extra stuff coming into real time, they can put it into the RSC test then.
Jeff, just for my understanding, state that last that second option for me again?
Yeah, let's say they fail the RSC test by 25 megawatts. The balancing authority that failed now has an obligation to carry an additional 25 megawatts of reserves above and beyond what they were covering anyways.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so I heard two items there. To the extent RUC is part of EDAM, which we haven't landed on yet, and I am going to allow a little bit of time today, if we can, to cross that bridge again and have a little bit more conversation on that. Increase that requirement, and obviously those allocation costs get spread to that associated BAA, or based on the amount the EDAM entity fails the RSC, increase their reserve requirement by that amount. Can I get some hands up and initial reactions to what Jeff just threw out there? And Jeff, thank you for throwing those up. That's exactly what this working group's for. I see Stuart Kelly at LA. Let's go to Stuart.
Yeah, I don't know how the increase in the reserve requirement at the BA, if I'm tracking Jeff, would actually work. And at the end of the day, the BA has ultimate responsibility. So I'm not. I don't know if that would work. And I'm actually now starting to contemplate, and maybe can discuss it more when we get to ROC. If we had a more graduated approach to all of this, in terms of, eased into EDAM without ROC, so that assumes there's no bid-in demand and no virtual bidding and the need to run a ROC process and just, rely on that load forecast and then, potentially maintain the ability to elect whether you can rely on the market if you're short or just freeze transfers. I just wonder if a more eased approach or simple approach into this helps, or if that just further complicates things, because I'm getting nervous about, what all this means, the failure and the additional RUC capacity and the implications that come from that, and still left holding the baby, so to speak, when it comes to reliability. If there's just quite an onus and on BAs that you would incline them not to participate. That's what concerns me.
Thank you, Stuart, for your comments. Danny or anyone else at the ISO have any thoughts or comments they'd like to add to those potential two approaches?
Sure, Mark. I think on the RUC comment, I know it's still an open item. I don't think that the CAISO as a BA would look to get rid of RUC, since RUC and convergence bidding are a core part of the CAISO's day-ahead market. So I'm not sure what this looks like with some areas having RUC and not having RUC. I think we can explore that if we need to. But the other comment I'd add on that, Stuart, is as we go forward and we try to talk about the confidence in EDAM transfers, I do think that RUC will play an important role in that.
Yeah, but I agree, Danny, and I don't know if that's even tenable to have a set of folks out of RUC and CAISO in RUC, but you're presupposing that RUC's going to happen, I think, with your comments. And I'm just wondering if there is an alternative there that, initial go live, and everything looks okay, and then you maybe introduce a RUC run and, whether virtual bidding's in or out. I don't know if a more graduated approach would help mitigate risk, or it would potentially add to the risk because you've got ISO and RUC and the rest out of it.
You're right, Stuart. I think I was presupposing a RUC a little bit, and I guess while everything's on the table, we have to have some assumptions when we start to think through how this will be designed. And so that's one that I've at least been, there are potentials for this not to have a RUC, but I think it gets a lot more complicated, and we haven't really given a ton of thought to what a day-ahead market that doesn't have a RUC looks like, for the ISO at least.
Well, you know, you start to say, well, why are we wasting time discussing it if it's presupposed it's in there, right? So.
Well, I don't think we've been wasting time discussing it. I think a lot of the discussion that's been happening is kind of providing an opportunity for everybody in this process to learn how RUC does work within the CAISO day-ahead market and the purpose it serves.
No, I'm not saying, I don't use the words wasting time. I'm wondering why discuss potentially not having RUC if it's already determined that it's going to be needed. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, but I don't want to go back and forth on it. I don't think there's been any decisions made. I think the ISO has tried to illustrate the benefits of having RUC in place, but you know, at the end of the day, this is all entities need to kind of come to a certain level of understanding and comfortability before moving forward on the RUC component. So thank you, Stuart. I see Drew with his hand up. Let's go to Drew. Oh, looks like you muted. There you go.
Oh, sorry about that. I did a hotkey and it raised my hand. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to raise it.
Oh, no worries. No worries. So, you know, before we move on and maybe open up the conversation to kind of carry on some of the hands that I left open at the end of the RUC and convergence bidding conversation, you know, so we've seen the hurdle rate proposal. I've heard a few things, pros and cons with having that in place. I see the administrative penalty having a few things, you know, pros and cons with that approach. You know, we heard Jeff at SCE potentially throw out two other ideas, you know, increasing reserves or, you know, to the extent there is a RUC, increasing the RUC requirement and, you know, that associated allocation going out to that BAA. You know, Dan kind of stated it where it almost sounded like, is there a need to have penalties at all in the EDAM timeframe, right? So to the extent an entity fails, you know, transfers are left open based on associated limitations and things like that, you know, their economic transfers, and then let the real-time RSC deal with any failures. And from a punitive standpoint, you know, I just wanted to throw that out there as, you know, quote unquote, option 4 or 5. I see Jeff Spires with his hand up from PowerX. Thank you, Jeff. Let's go to Jeff's line.
Thanks, Mark. Jeff Spires with PowerX. Just a couple of comments on this discussion and on these two options. Just at a higher level, I wanted to raise that I don't agree with the statement that was made towards the beginning, but a few people have kind of raised similar thoughts with respect to one of the value propositions of the EDAM being that it can fill an entity's capacity shortfall. I just don't think that that's what the intent of EDAM should be, and I think that the purpose of having a resource sufficiency test in place is to incent entities to take those steps in advance that they need to pass that test. This will, you know, we won't have a common RA requirement for the footprint that would ensure that entities have broad enough supply. So we have a resource sufficiency test that's intended to achieve that and to ensure that entities are not showing up short to the market intending to lean. And so I in my mind, when we're thinking about failure consequences and how effective they are, we need to be evaluating them against whether or not they have those or lead to those appropriate incentives to take those necessary steps up front before EDAM. And I think that limiting transfers is one approach, and what we've been talking about is the hurdle rate. I actually think is, and I think maybe Laura mentioned this, it really seems like that approach is essentially limiting transfers, but perhaps with the ability to relax that limit at some certain penalty price under certain circumstances. But in general, I think it is more similar to an approach of limiting transfers. The second idea here, though, of allowing transfers.
Hold on one second, Jeff.
Sure.
I don't mean to cut you off. So, and thank you for your perspective on it. I truly do appreciate it. Do you feel the dynamic hurdle rate, and I put air quotes, you didn't see me do that, does that make sense for it to be dynamic or some set price?
Well, that's hard to answer. I mean, I don't think that trying to tie it to the bilateral market makes sense to me because, again, you know, if there's a bilateral market available, then the entity is able to use that market to fill their resource sufficiency requirement. But what I think we would hope to see is that the requirements are well defined, the test is clear, entities have the time to take the steps they need to take to pass, and if they have all the information they need, then they should be able to do that. So I don't, you know, it sort of stems back to what I said towards the beginning, which is I don't think that the penalty price or the hurdle rate in that example should be set at a level that encourages entities not to take those steps and instead to use the EDAM as the tool to fill that shortfall. So, you know, again, I think if you start from the perspective of what are we trying to achieve, and what I'm suggesting is that we're trying to ensure that entities take the steps before EDAM, then a limit on transfers would only be relaxed once the price, or once a penalty price is reached that's high enough that causes that entity to take all the upfront steps that they need to pass, and that would really be a last resort. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. Thank you. Danny, I don't know if you had a comment on that, or Jeff, I believe you also had a second point you wanted to raise.
Well, I'll just, with respect to the second approach, I think for the same reasons I was just describing, that it wouldn't be effective because you're effectively allowing transfers and then applying some kind of notional penalty, which in my mind just undermines the incentives to pass the test if an entity can look at that and say that they're better off to enter the market short and have that transfer solve the problem instead.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate the perspective. Let me go to Kevin Smith, see if there's a reaction to that.
A reaction to your question. I don't disagree with a lot of what Jeff just said. But, you know, the reason that the idea of having penalties in the day ahead is that this all gets back to the firmness of transfers. And so, you know, with a day ahead market, one of the challenges is that while there are opportunities in EIM and other, you know, time frames, you know, I think it's important that we be able to decommit units or other things based on a price signal. And so if we're, you know, being optimized, we need to know that that optimization is reliable. And so to the extent entities are not coming fully resourced or there aren't any incentives, you know, there's always the risk that, you know, we don't have what we think we have going in. And again, the day ahead, you know, provides an opportunity for resources that otherwise might be committed or utilized to be decommitted and, you know, saving from an economic optimization. So that, again, this is, I'm not a technical expert. I'm just conceptually, that's how I understood and why I think there should be some kind of a structure there.
No, thank you, Kevin. Danny, did you have any thoughts, comments, or reactions based on the conversation thus far?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with a lot of what's said. All participants should definitely strive to have a plan to meet their obligations in the day-ahead time frame. I think taking a theme I've heard in the RSC a lot, though, and on the RSE kind of relaxing transfers, to the extent that an entity is resource deficient and there are bids that have voluntarily been made into this market, do we want the EDAM to be a venue to potentially cure that insufficiency? And I think the answer from the EIM is it looks like yes, because that's really what the intent of phase 2 of the EIM RSC is. And so it's simply like, are we extending that same type of thinking to EDAM is what we're trying to determine.
Thank you. Any thoughts, comments on failure consequences before we move on? I see Todd Ryan with his hand up. Let's go to Todd.
Any thought to whether there might be double penalization? I'm just thinking that what people are teeing up here is some kind of penalty in day ahead and some kind of penalty in real time. And you could imagine a BAA being, having the same 100 megawatt deficiency being penalized twice.
I think it would depend what the penalty is, Todd. I think to the extent that it's cured in day ahead and there's an EDAM transfer that then makes that BAA sufficient going into EIM, it wouldn't be double counted. If it's not cured in the day ahead process and it's present and it's cured between when the day ahead is run and when the real-time market is run, then it could be accounted for there, or it could eventually be accounted for in the EIM itself.
Thanks.
Hope that helps.
All right. Danny, are you good with me kind of teasing out any outstanding RUC or convergence bidding questions? Or did you have any?
I think we had outstanding questions from the end of last meeting, so we should use this opportunity to try to answer them.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to try to do that here in the next 10, 12 minutes to make sure I give Bob some time and then really give Milosh some time to help tee up the EDAM transfer conversation. So let me pose the question I mentioned earlier that I definitely want to make sure we get feedback on. Are there any lingering concerns, questions, or clarifications needed to help stakeholders become more comfortable with the elements regarding RUC and/or convergence bidding in the context of EDAM? So let me pause there to see if we have any outstanding questions, clarifications, or comments on those topics, that would help inform the straw proposal before moving on. I saw Dan Williams' hand come up first, so let's go to Dan, and then Michelle, if you wouldn't mind, let's also make sure we have George Angelidis, unmuted so that he can help respond to some of these with Danny. So let's go to Dan first.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. So just kind of wrapping up with, I think, the questions I had at the end of the session last time, and that was just a couple clarifications around virtuals and RUC. So when CAISO's been thinking about the potential for convergence bidding for EDAM BAs, have you been thinking that you would want them to have the same granularity as is available within the ISO? And I'm thinking about, ability to bid at supply hubs and nodes, but not at intertie points. I don't think if we covered that, and kind of a sub question of that is like, if it's down at the nodal level, does that have anything to kind of get sideways with not having CRRs at that level within the EDAM BAs? Is there an interplay there?
Hello, this is George Angelidis with the ISO. So it's not really related to the CRRs, but if we're going to establish a scenario where virtual bids can be used in an EDAM BAA, we would like to have consistency with how they're used in the ISO BAA. So yes, similar rules.
Okay, yeah, and my thought with the CRRs is just with the ability for virtuals to be used for hedging for congestion, just if there's anything else there to think about. But just, I know we're short on time, so I'll keep moving. So the other question that I had is just around if the EDAM BAs didn't elect to have convergence bidding, would simply the presence of convergence bidding within the ISO sort of quasi make that impact the EDAM BAs anyway, since a convergence bid in the ISO could set the SMEC that then would set the price for the EDAM areas regardless. So I guess it's just a question of, can you have one, can it be sort of kept to the ISO, or is it not really feasible to do that?
No, it's feasible. You can have some BAs having virtual bids in the solution of the IFM and some not. But you're right, virtual bids are treated in the IFM exactly as physical bids, both in terms of setting the price and in terms of congestion management. So it is possible if transfers do not hit their scheduling limits and you have a uniform price for marginal energy across the market footprint, it is possible that the virtual bid sets that price if it's the marginal resource.
Yep. Okay, and then the last thing was just clarifying a comment that I made on the last call that I think when I referred to RUC being out of the market, I was using that sort of more colloquially. The point there was that if the results of RUC aren't influencing the LMP from the IFM, which they're not, then that is not having the same impact on the market as if that capacity would have been procured in the morning market. So just thinking about a lot of the conversations that have been had about price divergence and the consequences of getting capacity at one point versus another, and the way that the bidding incentives have sort of shaped up over the years to deliver the market results that we've been seeing, and thinking about how that could be replicated in EDAM down the road. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Let's go to Paul Wood at Pacific Corp. Haven't heard from Paul today.
Hey, Mark, thanks. Paul Wood at Pacific Corp. Mark, to your question about RUC and convergence, I think from Pacific Corp's perspective, I mean, this is totally new to us. We really don't have any experience with either. I think we're going to need more time and more understanding about, the impact of those attributes.
Okay. Time and understanding, and maybe I could work with the ISO team to see if there's another opportunity for training on those two products.
Yeah.
Or elements.
That would be helpful, yeah.
Oh, I noted that. Thank you. I appreciate your comment, Paul. Let's go to Jeff Nelson.
Hi, it's Jeff from SE again. I'll just be really quick, but it just seems to me as we're talking through this that RUC plays a fundamentally different role for the ISO and for the other BAAs and EDAM. For the ISO, RUC is a reliability tool, right? This is what you're doing to make sure that you have secured enough capacity to keep your balancing authority secure based on your forecasts and all your other considerations. And in contrast, you don't have any responsibility to keep the other balancing authorities reliable. They do. So it's a real question to me on how RUC interfaces or interacts with the balancing authorities' decisions they need to make, the other balancing authorities need to make to keep their BA reliable. It's not as if the capacity procured by RUC feeds directly into their reserves. So it's just something to think about. It gets back to my earlier comment that if they fail the other test, the BA should carry reserves. So I probably added more confusion, but it's something that's been nagging me. Thanks.
No, Jeff, that's fine. This is a good question, and I'm glad that we have the opportunity here to answer it. So what RUC does essentially brings all these actions that the BAA operator will have to take for reliability into the market and fold them into the market so that they're a market solution, an action that's provided by the market through having reliability capacity awards, and you have a price for them and a settlement. So it's all transparent rather than having to be taken outside of the market. So if there is no rack there to start the resource because you need the capacity in real time, and the operator has to, out of the market, commit that resource, we end up at the same result, but the route of rack is more efficient and transparent, and it's a market result.
I understand the market aspects, but again, it's not the EDAM's operator's responsibility for maintaining reliability in the other BAAs, and somehow it feels like that's getting lost in this discussion.
All right. I saw Carly with her hand up. Can we go to Carly?
Hi, this is Carly Page, again from the Public Utilities Commission of Nevada. I would echo that concern. I think, for me at least, RUC does edge into RA and reliability that is not, at least what I was empowered to discuss here, which is a day-ahead market and not resource adequacy that is handled elsewhere. And I would really welcome any more education that you'll have on this and how it would apply to the other BAAs. And I guess specifically for me, is my understanding correct that kind of what George explained, that for every EDAM entity, the RUC in the day-ahead market would be run to basically make sure that real resources, not virtual bids, were available to meet the forecasted load? Or are we just talking about the option for other EDAM entities or generation owners to bid into CAISO's RUC and supply those resources? I don't know if I'm making sense, but hopefully.
George, Danny, did you want to opine on that?
Yeah, I can take a stab. I think RUC does more than just procuring or replacing and making sure that virtuals, that there's capacity to backstop virtual. I think James last week walked through different scenarios of how EDAM transfers itself could potentially have issues within an EDAM BAA, and then the RUC would make sure that there's enough counterflow scheduled back through the reliability capacity product such that going into real time, each BAA would be resource sufficient. So I would just suggest that to the extent that there's open questions, take a chance to review some of the examples that James put together and walked through last week. I think those were beneficial.
Thank you, Danny. All right, I'm going to do one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bob, make sure he has time to recap today's discussion. Let's go to Jan. Michelle, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Jan's line. I don't know. Michelle, are you with us? We do not hear you as the event producer.
Oh, you mean Jan. I thought you said Dan. I'm sorry.
Yes, Jan. Thank you.
I'm here. Yeah, and actually I was going to comment from last meeting where you were asking for, who supports RUC, who doesn't. On behalf of the IOUs in California, I think we all come to the position that we do support a RUC. And I will make this real quick observation. First, and this has been pointed out before, the RUC does represent the ISO substituting its own judgment for the market's judgment. So I think we have to accept that fact. It is in that sense an intrusion in the market. However, I think the consequences of not having a RUC are worse, because what happens is the ISO and other balancing authorities, I believe, are going to start taking what I'm going to call out-of-market actions to ensure reliability. If they think things aren't going well at the day-ahead stage, they will take out-of-market actions, which I think is the least desirable outcome. And as Jeff Nelson has pointed out, RUC is a market. So we do, and George, I think, did a really nice job of summarizing the advantages of having a RUC-based solution after the day-ahead market. So anyway, I just wanted to leave everybody with the understanding that the California investor-owned utilities do support including RUC in the EDAM.
Thank you, Dan, for your comments there. I appreciate that. And, just for the entire audience, I talked about some of the questions that are going to be getting posted later today for all stakeholders to kind of be able to provide their perspectives and feedback. RUC and convergence bidding will be part of those questions. So, to the extent you were unable to comment today, I know the ISO team looks forward to your informal comments on those two topics later today. So, Bob, let me turn it over to you, and I will just say, this might be the first time in 5 or 6 meetings I was able to get it to you on time, so apologies there.
All right, thank you, Mark. Can you just confirm you can hear me okay?
Yep, and Brenda, if you wouldn't mind going to the second to last slide, that kind of talks about the next steps, I'd appreciate it. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, so lots of discussion today, beginning with reviewing our financial failure consequences and the questions that Mark posed there. The first being, is there merit to increase consequences for persistent failures? Several comments and questions there, including a backstop to freeze transfer or some other form of backstop with details to be determined was suggested. Need for a process for coming out of the state and to return to participation. There needs to be a robust and transparent oversight, such as DMM reporting, for example, and how imposing consequences on BAA will translate to the underlying entities, and discussion on that topic. And then also discussion on the diversity credit and how capacity is considered in the RSE. Actually, I think the answer here was that this is really not considered in the EDAM, and rather the capacity is submitted in the RSE, and then the market optimization would provide the diversity benefits. The second question was thoughts on different levels of financial consequences depending on the time of year. Comments and questions based on system conditions when the BA is under stress should maybe be considered as a mechanism, although the counterfactual to use would be in question, or that question would need to be answered. Then the question about whether the on-demand advisory is still in play, and the answer was confirmed that it would be. We would need a process for curing, or a question about whether there's a process for curing, and the discussion about previously presented regarding bid range or capacity trading option is being considered as potential. Concerns about where extra supply would come from if the whole system is short. And then questions about failure consequences, timing, and the EDAM should have different mechanisms to help cure, to avoid failure in the WEIM. And then some questions about how demand response is viewed in the EDAM. And then finally, the last question, increased magnitude of the consequences depending on magnitude of failure. There seemed to be mixed support for applying a percentage. There's suggestions of a footprint-wide check, and then suggested approach is to increase RUC requirement or increase reserve requirement based on the amount of the deficiency. And then we had presentations on the financial consequences, options for hurdle rates, and then about the other option of administrative penalty rates. I think the hurdle rate discussion didn't seem to get a lot of support. Concerns about fixed rate providing gaming opportunities and adding artificial costs to the bids. And then some support seemed to be for administrative penalties, but also concerns that you're maybe countering the purpose of the market to have everybody help each other out. And then a concern about a double penalty in the EDAM and the EIM. I think that was answered as those would be considered and mitigated, so that there wouldn't be double penalties. And then we got into some further discussion about RUC and or convergence bidding, with some mixed review about whether or not entities support RUC and convergence bidding in the EDAM. And I think that covers everything we discussed today. So Mark, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that comprehensive summary. So, I heard a few times today, and we've heard it through several of these working group meetings, the importance around the conversation with EDAM transfers. This topic is going to be discussed this coming Wednesday. There are a few slides that the ISO team and Danny put together in this slide deck that has been posted, so I would encourage stakeholders to go take a look at that, to kind of help get the conversation, or at least formulate some questions you may have. And then we're going to have Bobby Olson from SRP also help frame up the conversation with several examples around EDAM transfers. I really appreciate everyone's engagement today. A lot of great questions, a lot of great comments. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.